The Rhodesian Bush War is a story of atrocity, of sickening loss of life, and the violent transition of a former European colony through independence toward majority rule. With civilians on both sides murdered and brutalized, and with allegations of chemical warfare and domestic terrorism thrown back and forth across the divide, this is a grim period of African history, not to mention a confusing one. We know that Rhodesia, as a nation, no longer exists and is instead Zimbabwe. And so, we know which side came out on top in the struggle. For a while though, units of the Rhodesian army were scoring massive victories against their enemies, conducting operations that were breathtaking, both in their brutality and in their effectiveness. At least, that's what the Rhodesian media reported. So, let's get to the bottom of this. Just how effective were the Rhodesian security forces, the losing side of the Bush War, and how did such an efficient and ruthless fighting force fail in its long-term objectives? Conflict in Rhodesia began not so much with an explosion of violence as with a glimmer of hope. The hope that a peaceful, meaningful transition to multiracial governance could be achieved. The roots of the conflict stretch back to the early part of the 20th century when southern Rhodesia became a self-governing colony of the British Empire in 1923. But it wasn't until the 1950s that real change arrived on the horizon. First came the formation of the Central Africa Federation in 1953, bringing together southern and northern Rhodesia along with Nyasaland, or the modern countries of Zimbabwe, Zambia, and Malawi. Next was the reformation of the African National Congress in southern Rhodesia, often abbreviated as SRANC, in 1957. Under the leadership of Joseph Nkomo, the ANC was the first real African nationalist opposition to the local colonial authorities, and a body that was keen to play a big role in the future of this multiracial, multicultural union of British protectorates and colonies. The Central Africa Federation was pretty short-lived. The promise of a fruitful union just wasn't enough to stop the growth of independent sentiment across the three states, and the experiment lasted only a little over a decade. This incarnation of the ANC wasn't built to last either, and survived only 2 years before it was broken up by the colonial authorities in 1959 and its leaders arrested. Not Nkomo though, as he was out of the country then. By January 1960, Nkomo was back. He founded the National Democratic Party with the view of providing an African voice to the shifting political landscape of the new decade. He would shortly be joined by the two influential leaders Robert Mugabe and Ndabaningi Sithole. And then came the hope, the briefest flame of democratic promise and of change without violence or conflict. Nkomo and the NDP attended the Southern Rhodesian Constitutional Conference held in January 1961. Excluded from political debate and action for so long, African nationalists found themselves on the brink of legitimization and agency. At the conference, 15 seats were effectively promised to Africans out of a legislature of 65. This was still a minority, despite the fact that black Africans massively outnumbered white Rhodesians, but it was progress nonetheless. Nkomo and the NDP delegation, so the official report tells us, accepted these proposals. And then, they didn't. Under pressure from his fellow NDP members, Nkomo reversed his decision. The NDP would not accept the proposals, and instead, it would push for more representation and self-determinations for Africans in the region. But the 1961 conference had been a take-it-or-leave-it event, and the NDP found themselves isolated completely from the political system in southern Rhodesia. But things were about to get even worse for the NDP. In December 1961, they were outlawed. Nkomo escaped arrest, once again, pulling the tried and tested move of being out of the country at the time. He would come back for a third bite at the political cherry, forming the Zimbabwe African People's Union, or ZAPU, which was once again banned in 1962, forcing Nkomo and his comrades into exile in Tanzania. By 1963, Sithole and Mugabe had had enough of Nkomo. Suspended by ZAPU, they formed their own party, the Zimbabwe African National Union, or ZANU, and a militant wing, the Zimbabwean African National Liberation Army, or ZANLA. Nkomo Zapu would form its own militant group, the Zimbabwe People's Revolutionary Army, or ZIPRA. Rhodesia now had two enemy factions on its doorstep. While ZANU and ZAPU were struggling to gain a foothold in Zimbabwe, another political tug-of-war was going on. The 1962 general elections saw the United Federal Party decimated by the Rhodesian Front. Sick of Nkomo and his lack of action, ZANU and ZANLA decided on a bolder approach. In July of 1964, ZANLA forces killed an official from the Rhodesian Front. What had been a glimmer of hope only 3 years before was now a civil war. To fight a war, you need an army, and the Rhodesian Front had one. As the gravity of the empire faded and Rhodesia looked toward independence, it kept hold of the Rhodesian security forces that had been the colony's military arm for decades. These were battle-hardened troops who had served the British Empire in conflicts in Malaya and elsewhere. After fighting Chinese communists in Southeast Asia, these units were now up against Chinese-trained fighters here in Southern Africa. This army might have been outnumbered, but they had experience on their side. They also had geopolitics on their side, at least in those early days of the war. To the south lay South Africa, a regime sympathetic to that of Southern Rhodesia. To the east, Mozambique, then still part of the Portuguese Empire. As insurgent attacks broke out in the mid-1960s, they were really concentrated along only a single front, the border with northern Rhodesia, by now Zambia. This gave the Rhodesian security forces a huge advantage, but there were other factors too. The early attacks by ZANLA and ZIPRA militants were limited in scope. They focused on attacking white landowners in locations accessible from the Zambian border and on disrupting oil pipelines delivering resources to Mozambique. These militants also seemed disinterested in pursuing any kind of recruitment or hearts and minds angle of operations. There were few attempts to rally local support, and instead, there were small-scale attacks followed by small-scale attacks, followed by more small-scale attacks. The Rhodesian forces found it relatively easy to pick these militants off. The Battle of Sonoya is a prime example of how these early years of conflict went. Often described as the first major engagement of the Bush War, Sonoya was a pretty one-sided affair. In April 1966, Rhodesian forces intercepted a ZANLA unit attempting to carry out insurgency activities in the north of the state. The Rhodesians engaged the insurgents, suffering no casualties and killing 7 ZANLA fighters. The surviving ZANLA troops disappeared back to the safety of the Zambian border. By the end of the decade, the Rhodesian forces were fully in control. Highly effective, incredibly well trained, and possessed of the kind of discipline and strategic resources the rebels just couldn't match, even with their communist training, the Rhodesians kept insurgency to a minimum. They completed routine patrols, engaged in sporadic firefights, and they kept ZANLA pegged back. ZANLA, aware that their efforts were not going well, sent fighters to the Soviet Union, to China, and to Cuba for training. The war was about to enter its second and altogether bloodier phase. In 1968, 4,500 miles away from Rhodesia, Portuguese dictator António Salazar suffered a massive stroke. Salazar, one of the last arch defenders of European colonies in Africa, would cling to life for 2 more years. Still, his ailing health spurred nationalist groups into action across Portugal's empire. By 1970, Salazar was dead, and by 1974, the empire was crumbling. Rhodesian Prime Minister Ian Smith now had a problem. The newly independent Mozambique wasn't quite so sympathetic to his cause of minority rule. The Bush War had just opened up another front, and Smith called the state of emergency. Security units were now operating outside of Rhodesia. In 1976, the Silos Scouts units crossed into Mozambique, obliterating a rebel training camp and wiping out hundreds of trainees. In Zambia, the ZIPRA group loyal to Nkomo downed 2 civilian airliners, seeking out survivors and executing them in the jungle. The Rhodesians drove into Zambia in response, conducting a mixture of conventional and special forces raids and claiming hundreds of kills. It is amid this escalation of violence that the ruthless efficiency of the Rhodesian security forces really began to show. The Silos Scouts, who we've already mentioned, became one of the most fearsome units of the entire war, conducting brutal missions with formidable levels of success. A unit that included black soldiers, the Scouts were able to use deceit, subterfuge, and local knowledge to achieve their objectives, tricking enemy combatants into a false sense of security and then eliminating them in cold blood. Operation Eland, for example, in 1976, pitted either 72 to 84 Scouts, reports vary, against up to 1,200 guerrillas. After masquerading as a friendly force and gaining entry to the rebel camp, the Scouts opened fire. Only 5 Scouts were wounded, while almost all of the guerrillas were killed. It has been alleged that the Silos Scouts used other tactics to achieve victory in the field, with some claiming that biological and chemical warfare was deployed by the unit. Accusations of murder, arson, and sexual assault were also leveled against the Scouts. The Rhodesian Special Air Services, or SAS, and the Rhodesian Light Infantry, RLI, were 2 more of the aces in Smith's hand. Well-drilled, well-led, and capable of frightening efficacy in the field, these troops were the scourge of the guerrilla fighters, both within Rhodesia and beyond the Mozambique and Zambian borders. Operation Dingo, also known as the Chimoio Massacre in 1977, saw RLI paratroopers, supported by the aging aircraft of the Rhodesian Air Force, drop into enemy territory with a clear objective in mind. A formerly Portuguese-owned farm that intelligence suggested had become a massive insurgent camp. With the SAS alongside them, the RLI swept into the camp in a devastating operation that reportedly claimed the lives of 1,200 insurgents, with 2 Rhodesians killed. Zanla sources do not dispute these figures, but allege that the casualty list included hundreds of innocent civilians gunned down by the SAS and RLI, something the Rhodesian security forces denied. The naming of the Rhodesian SAS was not a coincidence. Until independence, the Rhodesians had served as an integrated squadron of the elite British SAS fighting force, earning the respect of their comrades in British uniforms. These troops were battle-hardened and extremely skilled. They also maintained strict trigger discipline, conserving ammunition and maintaining their effectiveness in the field for far longer than the rebel forces could. On an engagement-by-engagement basis, there was no contest. The Rhodesian army was one of the most effective fighting forces the world has ever seen. What is the objective of a fighting force? What is the aim of military success? Well, to win a war, to emerge victorious. By 1977, Prime Minister Ian Smith understood he was facing a grave situation. The man who had been the architect of Rhodesian independence from the British Empire only 12 years before was now on the ropes, and the very existence of what he understood as Rhodesia was in doubt. Stepping up guerrilla attacks throughout the 1970s, black nationalist groups had begun to chip away at the resolve of white Rhodesians. Time and time again, the operations of these guerrillas failed. They were intercepted, engaged, and defeated by the highly effective units of the Rhodesian security forces. But a battlefield is not just a battlefield. To many, it is a livelihood, a place to work and live. And so, for many white farmers and landowners in Rhodesia, enough was enough. They began to leave. Already a minority, the white population of Rhodesia dwindled even further in the face of repeated guerrilla attacks and insurgencies. The morale boost of a Rhodesian army victory was one thing, but the threat of destruction and death was quite another, and so white Rhodesians began to flow out of the country faster than ever before. But there were other factors at play here. Rhodesia's white population had always been a relatively transient one. They lacked the roots that some of the African nationalists had, with generations upon generations of historical ties to the area. So when the choice came, stay or leave, it wasn't such a difficult one to make. The economy, too. Counterinsurgency operations, even successful ones, cost money, and a seemingly endless chain of successful operations require endless funds to back it up. By the late 70s, Rhodesia's public coffers were feeling the strain. So, in 1977, Ian Smith was at the negotiating table. Opposite him, Bishop Mozorewa, a moderate black leader and someone who was a little more acceptable to the regime and the remaining white population than rebel commanders like Mugabe. The result was inevitable, a transfer of power to the majority African rule, which began in 1977. Muzorewa would continue working with Smith, first as joint members of the Transitional Executive Council, and then installing Smith as Minister without portfolio until the end of 1979. Even after Mugabe's ZANU-PF party was swept to power in a landslide election win in 1980, Smith continued to serve in parliament. He retired in 1987. A maelstrom of economic pressures, dwindling support, negotiations with moderate leaders, and ceasefire talks with militants in London brought the Rhodesian Bush War to an end. For all the Rhodesian security forces' successes, they were on the losing side. So how does this impact the idea of the Rhodesian army as a wickedly effective fighting force? Our first instinct might be to say, not at all. Just look at the operational history. Engagement after engagement won, countless guerrilla fighters killed, minimal casualties, or even no casualties at all in many cases, for the security forces. These are textbook examples of how to win in the field. The Rhodesian army held up its part of the bargain, and it was political and economic factors that led to the collapse of Rhodesia. But is this really the case? Everything we've seen up to now paints the Rhodesians as well-drilled soldiers chalking up victory after victory in the field. But what about those longer-term goals, the political and strategic moves that are required to truly win a war? Weighing up the dual narratives of the Rhodesian security forces during the Bush War, historian Danny Bagg raises some interesting points. Answering a question on Quora, Bagg discussed the perception of the Bush War among white Rhodesians and the sort of language used to describe it. Gangsters. That's how the insurgents were often described. Communist gangsters carry out acts of crime against civilian-owned farms and infrastructure, typically white civilian-owned. This was a crime wave, surely not a war, and when rebels were arrested, brought into police custody, tried in civilian courts, well, this just solidified the idea that Rhodesia was battling criminal thugs rather than political organizations with very real ideological and cultural objectives. The war on drugs, the war on crime, the war on terror. These ideas of a military campaign against a criminal element have become part of our global understanding. But not so much in the 60s and 70s. Back then, to use the language of crime to describe the landscape of war simply meant there was no war at all. There was just a bunch of bad guys seeking to create mayhem. So when white Rhodesians opened up newspapers or turned on TV sets and were met with the statistics of an operation, 20 or 30 enemies killed, weapons seized, no Rhodesian casualties, they must have thought victory was assured. The white minority was placated, the Rhodesian forces carried on their operations, and the political factors underlying were ignored. By the time the Rhodesian government realized its mistake, it was too late. The transition to a biracial government and the introduction of universal suffrage might have eased some of the political strife that fractured the nation had these moves been made years before. Still, by 1978, 15 years of conflict had taken its toll and there was no way back. The entire struggle might have been avoided if the NDP had not rejected the constitutional reforms of 1961, or if the Rhodesian Front had not excluded the NDP from subsequent negotiations. But this is just conjecture. But these are still political factors. We're still looking at the media presentation of the war and at the failure of the government to address the root causes of the problem. What could the Rhodesian military themselves have done differently? Perhaps the perception of the war wasn't only being manipulated by the government and state media. It could be that army commanders were also getting it wrong. While Rhodesian units were counting kills and reporting victories, the strategic balance was tipping the other way. By the mid-1970s, Zanla and Zipra guerrillas were gaining significant support across the country, bringing more and more of the black African majority over to their side. While they'd failed to win the hearts and minds of African Rhodesians in the 1960s, the 1970s were very, very different indeed. Huge swaths of Rhodesia became no-go areas for white minority settlers as guerrilla units expanded their influence across the region. While coming out on top in a firefight was the speciality of the Rhodesian forces, African nationalists acted with more guile and tactical nous, achieving the kind of broad support that would eventually bring them victory. There are subjective opinions and there are objective facts. It's so important to stick to the latter as we examine the Rhodesian army. So what are these facts? It's a fact that the Rhodesian army was incredibly effective in the field. Fighting countless engagements across a war that lasted well over a decade, the Rhodesians did not lose a single one. Reports of actual casualty ratios vary, but most suggest that it was seriously lopsided. For every single Rhodesian life that rebel groups took, they paid dearly with dozens of their own. It's a fact that Rhodesian army units were among the best trained and most ruthless in the world. The Rhodesian SAS had not simply been trained with the British SAS, they had been part of the SAS. They'd seen action and learned all about what it means to tackle a guerrilla force. The Sealer Scouts, on the other hand, took the guerrilla action back to the rebels, utilizing deceitful and guileful tactics to carry out devastating operations. But it's also a fact that Rhodesia is no more. The nation became Zimbabwe Rhodesia after the transition to majority rule, and then simply Zimbabwe after Mugabe's ZANU-PF election victory in 1980. The Rhodesian army, through a mixture of strategic short-sightedness and external political and economic factors, was on the losing side of the Bush War. It's easy to lay this blame squarely on the government, but the tactical decisions of the armed forces also have a case to answer. While the Rhodesian army celebrated the latest operational victory, it was losing control of large swaths of territory. When they finally noticed, it was too late. But what do you think? Was Rhodesia fighting an unwinnable war? From a military perspective, what could the Rhodesian security forces have done more strategically and tactically to secure victory? Could the whole situation have been avoided in 1961 with a more serious attempt at genuine multiracial governance and equality for black and white Rhodesians? Let us know in the comment section below. As always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you learned something new.